Alright, hi, this is Kalea Smith, and this is my presentation that I've titled, Why Do the Survivors Survive? What the Titanic Teaches Us About Sex and Class. So the first thing that we need to know when it comes to learning from such a tragedy like the Titanic is, figuring out who is involved, who are the people, who are the passengers. So I've made this bubble graph, and you can see that the majority of the passengers were male, and then female was just a little smaller. See that 64% were male, 36% female. Obviously this is based on a data set from 1912, so does not account for any gender diversity or intersex people, just purely relies on whatever binary sex was assigned at birth. The other way that we can look at the passengers on board was by class. So you'll see that in this bar graph here, horizontal bar graph, the vast majority of passengers were third class, 709 out of the 1,309. However, when you look at the total fare paid by the passenger class altogether, you'll see that instead it's almost flipped, where second class is still low in both. However, first and third class switch spots, and the vast majority of the fare is paid by first class. 323 people pay almost $30,000 about. Whereas 700 people pay almost 10, so a third of the price. One thing to keep in mind is that the passenger class may not account exactly for class status in society. A first class passenger on board here could potentially be a third class person who was gifted a ticket. But I would say for the majority of these, I think it's safe to assume that based on how high and how different the prices in fare were, probably most first class passengers aboard the Titanic were first class or high class people, upper class, you could say. So when you look at the total population from the Titanic, however, after this huge commercial tragedy, a majority of the people perished on the ship's maiden voyage. We see that these were the count of all the passengers split up by class. The largest population aboard was the third class males, and more than double any other population. However, there were more males in each class as well, but most of the ship was third class males. Now let's talk about who survived. Our overall perspective on the population. By binary sex here, you see our largest population is men who did not survive. Our second largest population is women that did survive. So let's dive into that. And see that, again, the majority of those who survived were female. So out of that 1,309 people, only 500 people survived. That's a 38% survival rate. 68% of the survivors were female, 32% were male. Now again, we shift perspective and keep in mind also class. So our largest population here is those third class males that did not survive. remember that was our largest population on board, so that is somewhat potentially skewed that way because there's just more of them. Also note that most of the passengers here are male, and that smaller percentage is female. This little sliver here is our smallest population, which is those first class females that did not survive. That was 5 women, and then 12 second class women did not survive. Now let's take a look at just the survivors. We have another tree map here. However, this one filters out all those who did not survive. You've got this large class of first class females. That is 139, 25 second class males. So those survivors. I put together a full contingency table so you can see the raw data here. And we look into survival rates with sex and class in mind. So I took the time to break down survivability by class. See, first class people, female and male, there was a 62% survival rate. Then that drops about 20%, drops a little bit less than 20% again for third class. However, when you look at the percentages of male to female, you also note that there was a higher percentage of males out of the total males that survived, as opposed to the total females that survived out of those total females on board. So what can we learn from who survived this tragedy? Some things have changed since 1912, and some things are still changing as we work and progress as a society. But what can we learn is who gets helped first, or who may be prioritized by others, is affected by social bias. There's a stigma against lower class citizens, and there's, sexism is still real. Potentially in different forms than it was in 1912, but that's something to keep an eye on, is looking into our own social biases based on the past and not making the same mistakes in the future. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something.